Hello, everybody. Oh my goodness. Oh, Lady P, look at you being on time. Okay, I'm Brian. Uh, this is the Breaking Down Security Twitch stream. Do not adjust your television sets or monitors, or whatever it is you're watching this on. I do have another guest this week. It's raining guests. I don't know if it's springtime or whatever, but we had Joe Gray on talking about some OSINT stuff and Chat GPT on Sunday. Today we have Lynsey Wolf, who's
Hey,
going to be
Ron.
talking with us about insider threat investigations. A little bit of bookkeeping before we get started. I'd like to thank Y Candy for subscribing to us on Twitch, and also Heathen Twitch 14 for following, Gregor Bizwanger for following us as well. Yeah, so thank you all for your support and what helps make this possible, having Lynsey and spending time doing this. So I very much appreciate that. So, Lynsey, hello, how are you today?
Good. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Oh, that would be me. Okay. Yeah. See, see, it's not you, it's me, I think. So,
We hope.
1 second. This works normally. So, okay, give it another shot.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Maybe not.
Monitor off, monitor on. Yeah, we have, I see that, Lady P. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Everything just works until it doesn't. So, okay, try to say something, Lynsey.
Can you hear me now?
There it is.
Woohoo!
Okay, I don't know why the virtual audio cable is not working. Hello, DFI Jesse. Hello, thank you. I can hear you. Yes. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I know Lindsay's hearing me. So
I can hear you.
okay,
Hopefully people can hear me.
we'll fix it in post.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, we'll fix it in post. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah. But so again, welcome Lynsey to the show.
It's great to be here. I'm really excited. I love talking about this stuff, so it should be a great conversation.
Very cool. Okay, so as we normally do, we've never had Lynsey on the show. So what we want for all of our new folks to come on our show to give us a little background, how your superhero origin story, if you will. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you're doing, and what interests you about insider threat.
So my career started right after college. I had a couple of really interesting positions, contract positions, working with the FBI doing investigations. I had graduated, or I just graduated with a master's degree in cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and intelligence. Sounds like a mouthful, I know. And then I've always been invested or interested in like law enforcement, investigative work, data analytics, things like that. Most of my technology interest or computer interest comes from building computers and playing a lot of video games. But then I also really
Nice.
liked, the investigation side of things, which kind of brought me into law enforcement. And then doing those few contract positions, I got to assist in kind of spinning up like cyber programs for various smaller kind of organizations. And then I was really interested in honing more of my technical skills. So I started working in a security operations center for CVS. That was many, many years ago now. But I got to learn a lot about incident response, targeted alerting, and really understanding kind of the technology behind some, very well-known malicious incidents that we all know, Trojan horse, worm coming in, or responding to all those random malwares that we are so used to seeing. But I really wasn't super interested in that kind of external threat piece because I was more interested in the
Hmm.
human, because again, my whole background was based in like law enforcement and like learning about humans and learning about their behaviors. So that's what kind of got me interested in insider threat. I didn't really even know that it was a career at first. And then that's where I started at DTEX, going on, I think, 7 years ago now. And I became an insider threat analyst. And it was really cool to kind of meld my interest in, human investigations with technology. So that's where I am now. And now I've been kind of, I guess, basically studying insider threat for the last 7 years and been kind of trying to understand how we can not only detect on it, but prevent it. Very similar to how, we've done that for external threats like malware and stuff since, the dawn of the
Right.
computer.
Okay, excellent. Those of you who are watching on our LinkedIn or our YouTube or Twitch, please feel free to drop some questions in the chat. I'll do my best to try to find them. Lady P, who's also one of our moderators, will also take a look at your questions and make sure that we can get them answered for you, because there are no wrong answers. If you feel like you need to ask that question, and then it's important to you and it's important to me. So I want to make sure that everybody can get their questions answered. So we do have some questions. We did pre-wire this conversation as much as we possibly could with some questions. Thanks to Tony Loftus at the PR company that reached out to us and got Lynsey on the call with me. But so we've got some questions here. So one of the first questions that came up was, what is the you say there's a difference between insider threat and insider risk. So let's do some definitions first. What do you call insider threat, and what do you call insider risk?
So the insider threat would be the more kind of grander picture. What we like to kind of describe it as, it's the entire employee population of an organization, because you have all of these people that are working in one organization, and they all have the potential, whether intentional or not, to become an insider risk. So we usually say that insider threat is kind of 100% of your population, where insider risk is that 1% of your population that something bad happens. Again, whether it sometimes be intentional or not, you kind of have to understand, I guess, the risk of like what you're actually looking at, because if you don't understand what your organization is doing as a whole, then you can't pick out like what is risky, what is the threat, and so on, if that makes sense.
Right.
Because there's everyone has the potential to do something bad. Again, whether it's negligent or malicious or not, that can come from training. And if organizations know like what employees are doing wrong or what employees are doing differently, they can address that.
Right. So when I was in the Navy, some of the anti-terrorism, anti-espionage kind of stuff training that we took, brought in examples like Robert Hansen, who was a spy for the government. Obviously Edward Snowden, and the recent person who was an Air National Guard person. I think I've got links in our show notes for that. Spreading these secrets about the Ukraine's war and other things. There's a motivator, right? And we learned about something called MICE, which is money, ideology, compromise, and ego. That was what we learned there. Is there a different kind of motivators or different kind of ways that you kind of, rate people or rate organizations who might have a high ideology issue or, high dollar issue or anything like that? Do you use different kind of motivators, or are there different kind of motivators other than those four?
Honestly, I think anything can become a motivator, not just those four, because depending on, how a person is feeling, they could just be upset with their organization as a whole and want to do something to get back at it. So I feel like limiting it to those just four kind of limits your entire outlook on what a potential like risk could be. Kind of what you're describing is more of like an espionage issue, in my opinion. And espionage in my world is really just one type of like insider threat. It's just one type of kind of user profile that we look towards. And again, with espionage, the motivator really does kind of come down to money or compromise to, do bad to the system, but while also making a profit. I've worked in a lot of investigations, some really interesting stuff. Nothing as big as maybe, Snowden or leaking National Guard secrets. But one thing that we've looked at is looking at collusion, where there is employees working together and actually selling trade secrets to other organizations. And their motivator is they were leaving to that other organization. So they wanted to use as many corporate resources as they could to bring over with them when they left. Now, we don't know why they left, why they wanted to move to this other organization. Maybe it was money. Maybe they were unhappy with the way the organization was being run, things like that. But I try not to limit like the motivators of any sort of kind of profile. But again, espionage or
Right.
any of that is pretty much like just one aspect of what insider threat is. That's just one kind of user profile that we would describe.
Okay. Yeah, I just posted in chat the one where the person who left Google for stealing secrets was sentenced to 18 months in prison for trying to
Mm-hmm.
take automated, auto self-driving car secrets to Uber. So yeah, there was some discussion there on that one. That was back in 2020. But yeah, I guess there's some high profile stuff. But then it's like, oh, I accidentally left some stuff in a Google Drive, and it's, oh, hey, this would be something good to use in another organization, and then you find out it's like IP. But
Yep.
um, yeah. So one of the things that got me in the initial email from the PR company was that 75% of investigations are started by the human resources department, and I was like, why would they be doing that? You would think it would be the SIM and logging and detection folks who would be like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we've noticed some activity after hours or something like that. HR, why HR?
So we've actually this was kind of news to us as well in the beginning of the year. I think it does have a lot to do with the difference in corporate lifestyles happening kind of post pandemic and kind of where were we at pre pandemic. I mean, a lot of us were workaholics. And then
Right.
kind of post pandemic, after we kind of introduced this idea that we could work from home, have a little bit of a better work life balance. There was changes in kind of how corporations were operating and the average workday. So what we've come to realize is that HR has a lot of useful data to really assist both, SOC teams or investigative teams and things to really identify who has the potential to become an insider threat or an insider risk and kind of expand that risk profile. Now I'm
Mm-hmm.
not trying to say that, we're targeting certain people and surveying them or surveilling them. Like this is not, some sort of targeted surveillance where we pick out this user because they did something bad and now we want to lock them down and things like that. It's more about understanding, again, your actual employee population. So HR has a lot of access to data on, employees that may be on an improvement plan, employees that may be unhappy with the way their job is. A lot of times employers, you're or as an employee, you're not talking to your manager about something, you're talking to an HR rep about how you're doing at work or things like that. And then it gets back to the
Right.
manager. But sometimes it doesn't. We've realized that it sometimes doesn't get back to the manager, and then managers and even executives don't actually know what's happening with their population. So the
Right.
data that we're looking at is that HR has information on the people that are leaving the organization. Now, more often than not, it's going to be a leaver that is going to be responsible for a data exfiltration event. Again, whether they mean to or not.
Okay.
Um, a lot of people will, write code or work on projects or do things at an organization, and then they'll be like, well, I did all of this, so I'm taking it with me. It's mine. But more
Right.
often than not, it's you created that for a particular purpose or for that organization. It's now that organization's intellectual property. So that's why a lot of people will mistakenly take data because they thought it was theirs. They weren't trying to do any harm to the organization. They were just taking what they thought were their resources away. But a lot of times, what they're doing is they're preparing that stuff prior to giving HR their 2 weeks or prior to actually notifying any one of them leaving, regardless. So that's kind of some of the data profiles that we look towards is looking at differences in behaviors before someone is getting ready to leave. And so HR has a lot of that data because they know who's leaving, they know who's already left, and they also know who is potentially a problem. Now, most of the data that I look at is anonymized, so I have no idea who it is that I'm looking at anyway. I could, and even if it wasn't anonymized, I don't work for the organizations, so I have no idea, who Bill, Andy, or Sue is that I'm looking at. They could be anyone in the organization. So it's not really
Right.
about targeting those individuals for me. It's more about understanding what drove them to make those choices and how we can improve upon that. So when we work with HR, we can actually use it for good. Where oddly enough, I was talking to an individual today, and he worked on a program where they were kind of correlating HR data with kind kind of their LinkedIn profile updates. And they were seeing how often people were updating their LinkedIn profiles for when employees may not have been talked to in a positive manner. So like if you had a review or something like that and you didn't get your year-end review or you didn't get positive feedback, so you started updating your profile looking for another job. If we had access to that data, we'd be able to know ahead of time if this employee was unhappy and remediate that issue before it actually becomes a bigger problem. So that's why working with HR
Okay.
has been a huge kind of uptick in actual behavior analytics for us, especially with all of the
Right.
investigations that I'm involved in. And I think it's something that a lot of people are nervous about. And I definitely understand that because it can be, big brother is always watching type of thing. But I
Right.
really like to, talk about it in a way that we're not trying to target people, and we're not trying to target people who are going to do bad things. A lot of times what we're trying to do is actually help the employee base actually understand the thoughts and understand the reactions of an employee population.
Okay. Um, so we were talking a little bit
Hmm.
before the show started here, and one of the things that I was thinking about on my walk was um, uh, it- obviously the chance of insider threat increases probably as the company gets bigger. I
Yep.
had said, if you've got three people in a startup, all three people, or the one person knows the other two fairly well. I would hope that they're not going to do some insider threat, so your chances of insider threat may be low.
Hmm.
Versus where, not to throw out a name, but you could be the Google of the world and have 2 million people, and some sort of or form of insider threat is almost 100%. You're either going to have people leaking things to the press, or you're going to have somebody accidentally uploading an email to an external vendor, or something like that. Um, is there a sweet spot where your company gets called in, or you get called in and said, okay, hey, we've just M&A'd a company, and maybe it didn't go so well, and we want to have you come in and make sure that everything's all still nice and happy. We know that we don't have a very good work culture because we have a CEO who likes to spout things on his social media platform that is not very positive. Do you have people who are self-aware enough to know, hey, we might actually have an insider threat problem, or there may be an insider threat problem because our company does X, Y, and Z? What does it look like when they engage you?
Yeah. So surprisingly, it's a lot more like, or it's a lot more of an open conversation than you would think, especially with a lot of customers that I work with. I assist a lot with not only investigations, but using some of the data for policy making or policy enforcement. So a lot of times the teams that I work with will have all these policies that they have, and they're not enforced because they either don't have the data that they can utilize to kind of say, hey, this is a really big problem, we need to adjust it. As you said, we know that it's an issue, we just have no way of enforcing this policy because we don't really know how big of a problem it is. So I work with a lot of again, I'm not really working with the policy enforcers or makers, but I'm working with the operational teams, like kind of the boots on the ground. So people like me, analysts, SOC team members, NOC team members, things like that, that are kind of just in the weeds of this data and don't really know what to do with it. So in my opinion, if more organizations were open-minded about, hey, we really should tell our CEO that they shouldn't be doing that on Twitter. They shouldn't be accessing social media on their corporate laptop. That's one thing what I like about being anonymous and having like data and having people anonymous, because then I don't know who I'm investigating. So even if I was investigating the CEO, I wouldn't know it. And that's what I think a lot of organizations should adopt. If like people can't be biased in their organizations, they can't be biased in their investigations, because just because a member is, a high ranking official doesn't mean that they could skirt around certain policies, because most policies are in place to protect the organization and protect the data. So
Right.
it's kind of a slippery slope too. It's like, well, I'm the CEO, I want to make decisions. I'm like, well, do you want to make decisions that benefit your company, or do you want to make decisions that are going to, worsen the attitude of your company and then create more insider risks within it because of what you're saying and what you're doing? So
Right.
it can be interesting. There isn't really like a threshold that you can put on it. Like there's no like magic number to say, hey, your risk is at an 8 and your risk is at a 5. How do I get to a 5 from an 8? You can always put numbers on anything, and we do use some scoring to assist organizations to kind of put it on paper and show them, like, hey, this is where you
Right.
sit for this industry, and this is where some other people are. But ultimately, it's more about understanding your organization, understanding what's normal for your organization, and then identifying when that normal becomes weird, when those activities start to stray from the normal, because those are where your risks are going to populate. And that's where you need to be more cautious too. But you can't really put numbers on those things ultimately, because again, it's more about the behavior analytics, not just these kind of targeted investigations.
Right, right. Yeah, that was one of the questions that I was trying to figure out. You know, how did HR figure all of these things out? Are you using
Mhm.
things like, you know, a CASB or UABA in this case, which is a I actually have a link here for user
Entity
entity
behavior.
behavioral
Yep.
analytics. Yeah. Is that a system? I don't want to say, is that a system y'all have, but I mean, it's like, uh, are those the kind of metrics where they're gathering that information, or I mean, how would I guess I should back up. It's like, how would HR know that it's time to contact you? Or, you know, like my company, I actually have a company that's big enough that we have an insider threat team.
Hmm.
And so, you know, obviously there's a little mistrust there, or what appears to be mistrust, but um, what information would make HR think, hey, we probably need to have an investigation done on, you know, a number of people, or, you know, we send out this press release, or, you know, something happened on Twitter where it's like, oh, great, we're supporting, you know, JK Rowling or something like that, and, you know, we're in San Francisco, so it's probably not a good thing. You know, what kind of information are they gleaning that information from? Because I'm thinking of privacy issues as well here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up piracy. I'll definitely get to that in a second. But with HR, HR has access to, you know, again, as I said earlier, to data on like leavers, on, you know, employees that are on improvement plans, and like employee morale, pretty much. So
Right.
it's when
Right.
they start to see dips in those things, or if they know that they have a few like users that are leaving the organization, that's a really great time to kind of let your SOC know, or let whoever is doing the investigations, whether it be a company like me, like DTEX, that you know you've worked with to spin up an insider threat program, or it's your SOC team that is monitoring your entire user population or your network population, and you're kind of looking for, you know, data going out, things like that. It's those instances
Mhm.
that HR really needs to kind of hone in on. And a lot of times HR doesn't have the ability to kind of look at that type of data. They're not specialized in data analytics like an analyst would be. So sometimes they don't really know what to do with the data they're looking at, but they do know that these employees are leaving. So they want to recognize those
Right.
things. Um, we also have what we use at DTEX is called DMAP. So it's the data, machines, applications, and people. And we use that type of technology. So again, we're not just sitting here collecting metadata and spitting it out and saying, hey, here is your risk. We're trying to identify when those behaviors become an issue, and HR can help us do that by targeting certain groups of users based on what they know about the user population. And it's not to say that these users are doing anything bad. It's just that, hey, this user doesn't seem too happy. They're uploading their resume to career websites. They're researching new jobs. They're researching their salary. We may want to have a conversation with them and see what we can do to help them, what we can do to improve their experience at the organization itself. Um,
Okay.
then, kind of going back to the privacy aspect, there are certain, I guess, types of um, like data points that organizations can collect. It's one of these things that there's a way to mitigate risk without affecting like employee trust.
Right.
Organizations kind of need to be mindful of how and like what data is being collected. So there's a whole bunch of types of data that you can collect. You can do video capture, email content, keystroke logging, what else? Like accessing the camera on your computer, process activity, network activity, URLs being accessed. There's so many different like data points that can be collected that can help you identify, insider risk. But there's certain data points that are really high in a contextual value, and but they're also have a really high impact to like privacy and also performance and things like that, whether it be on an endpoint solution or a process or something that you're using. Those high contextual
Right.
values is things like video capture or like file content, email content, things like that, keystroke logging. Again, that's all really high contextual values because it gives you exactly what's happening on a machine. You capture exactly what an
Mm.
individual is doing. But that's really low when it comes to privacy standards. People are like, that's really surveilly. That's, they're always watching me. If they're capturing video, they're capturing my camera. So that's, if
Yes.
you're kind of admitting to collecting those things and monitoring those things, your employee trust is going to go way, way down. But then there's also those activities that are really high contextual value, but kind of on the other scale of impact to privacy. Those types of data points, are looking at window activity, process execution, network activity, but not like focused on, the user itself, but just the behaviors around those things. Does that make sense? How like you can get
Right.
like there's data points that are really high in like context, but really low in privacy, and you want to lean more towards the high in context but low in privacy over here, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, back in the day before, you worked, with people around the globe and what have you, you would set certain policies and it's like, why is Brian trying to remote into a server at midnight on a
Mm-hmm.
Saturday? He's like, what? There's no reason for Brian to be doing that unless there was an incident or something like that.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about the customer trust thing. And there have been stories that I've seen of like call centers where it's like really cringy, where, the cameras are on,
Yeah, and
or,
you don't really need
yeah,
that though. Like you don't need like a
right,
video log of someone to know like, all right, I opened a Word document and I typed something in. But like I don't need to
right,
know what they typed in. I don't need to know what's in that file. There are, things out there that, will rate the, sensitivity of a file, but I don't necessarily as an analyst need to know what that is. But I do need to understand where that file is being stored, who's accessing that file, and like how many, iterations of that file exist in an organization. But that's all without actually knowing what the file is. So,
right.
and you can do a lot more with that, all those other points versus I've collected a video of you typing in something in this file that you shouldn't have. Like you're
Right.
typing in sensitive secrets on this file and sending it out to your Gmail. Well, I just want to know if you're sending it out to your Gmail. You have, you're typing in a file, like you probably shouldn't be sending anything out to your Gmail regardless. It's your corporate machine. You should be using your corporate Office or Outlook, whatever the solution is. So like that's kind of
Yeah.
the idea behind it. It's not really about the file itself. It's more about the behavior of the user, utilizing their personal webmail account versus their Outlook account or whatever corporate solution it
Right.
is.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like you've got some CASB stuff, you got some UABA stuff, you got some DLP that you're pulling from. Do so when you're brought in to do
Mm-hmm.
investigations, how much of it is like you coming in to kind of, I wouldn't say like trying to find out if somebody's done something illegal. I imagine that you're not always coming in for that, but
No,
um, not always.
no, I'm not always looking for the bad guys necessarily. Sometimes I'm helping customers identify, like I was talking about earlier, more like policy management, or even
Right.
to save the company money. You have
Sure.
these, 1,000 licenses for Adobe Pro, but you have 5 users that are utilizing Adobe Pro. Why are you paying for 1,000 licenses when
Oh,
you only need 5? So those are
yeah. That,
types of things that I help organizations do as well. Doesn't necessarily indicate insider threat, but like how people are
right.
using processes is definitely something that is in the realm of insider threat. How processes are being spawned and things like that. But then there's this whole other side of the thing where it can actually help an organization identify where it may be weak in certain other aspects, like financially.
Right. Okay.
Those aren't as fun though
So
as the intense investigations. You know, obviously the as an analyst, we're always interested in kind of diving in the weeds, you know, really kind of honing in on like what did this user do? What can I find out?
right.
And how can I assist this organization, you know, is catching, you know, this individual. But I'm not really, as much as I am concerned, I'm not necessarily concerned with catching the individual. I'm more concerned with kind of identifying the behaviors of that individual. So I'm gonna be like, all right, how do I look for this elsewhere? Like this user did all these really cool things. I mean, they did it for bad reasons,
Right.
but they did all these really cool things. How do I use that kind of information to identify this similar type of incident elsewhere?
Right. Um, let me see. So I say, how can organizations be mindful of how and what data they're collecting to mitigate risk without affecting employee trust? Yeah, who watches the watchers to ensure data is being handled responsibly?
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you, I mean, obviously, like we've already mentioned some of the privacy stuff. There's things like GDPR. There's the CCPA. I actually found a website where they have like 25 different countries who, you know, different privacy requirements that they have, or privacy standards like Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah.
Those they all have different requirements. Are you U.S. based only? I mean, you know,
I
how does your job work with other countries, or are you just specifically in the United States?
I mean, I'm located in the United States, but I actually work with organizations all over the world. And we do stay GDPR compliant, which is great. And really, that comes from kind of this whole idea of transparency. And that kind
Hmm.
of comes from, you know, employee communications and, you know, identifying, you know, what is collected and what is not being collected. In my opinion, a lot of organizations right now are collecting far too much data. And most of the data is pretty unusable because there's no context to it.
Yeah.
So there's with staying GDPR compliant, this is what I was kind of going towards when there's like these high contextual data points but low privacy concern. Those are the ones that you want to focus on. And we do focus on those ones to stay GDPR compliant because we're not, you know, doing any file content. I don't really care what's, like I said earlier, I don't really care what's in a file. I don't care what you're typing into your email. I don't care that, you know, what, you know, you're, you know, watching online. But I do care when, you know, that what you're watching online, you know, spawns a process somewhere, or you've clicked on a link and it's now brought you to a malicious website or something like that. I care about those
Right.
things, but I don't necessarily care what you're, you know, doing on those sites. Again, it's all within reason because you should be staying like compliant with your company policies. You should be mindful of, you know, your activities that you're doing. And again, in my opinion, I understand that it might be a less popular opinion, but I think all users should understand that if you're working on a corporate laptop, you should realize that you kind of lose your right to privacy on what you're doing on that laptop. You don't own it.
Right.
And then there's this whole kind of decision of like bring your own device, but you're accepting that you're saying there's no right to privacy by bringing your own device to work and utilizing it for work. There are certain
Right.
there are certain policies in place, like you've accessed a corporate network, but it's your personal device accessing a corporate network. Whatever you're doing within that corporate network is no longer personal, it's now owned by the company. So I think
Right.
I feel like that's a notion that I would really like, you know, more people to understand. And that doesn't mean that we're, you know, or organizations like me or any type of, you know, monitoring tool out there, or all of this idea of kind of surveillance and targeting investigations and things like that. It's not about like what it's not really like we're targeting you individually. It's you should realize that an organization is going to monitor your laptop. It's just
Right.
about how they're
Yeah.
monitoring it. And like I said, I think today in this day, a lot of organizations collect far too much data. And again, a lot of it is unusable because they're raw data logs that have no context. And there's no point in that.
Right.
So it's really about
Right.
organizations kind of being somewhat upfront about what they're collecting and what they're monitoring and how they're utilizing it. And that's kind of to gain employee trust. But then for, me and, what I do on a regular basis, as I said before, most of the data that I'm looking at is anonymized. I don't have access to anyone's laptop specifically. I just have access to this metadata that's being collected. Like I'm not, logging into someone's machine, pulling down a bunch of data and then, taking it and analyzing it. I'm just looking at it from a very high level contextual view. And again, most of the data points that I'm looking at are just really simple, like window activity, file system activity, but like no content inspection or anything like that. So there's a lot that you can do with like a minimal data points.
Right. Yeah. Don't want to derail this too much, but you talked about, giving up your right to privacy when you're using,
Mm-hmm.
your work device. And when I started work, I moved up here to Seattle in 2014, and I
Mm-hmm.
got a job with an endpoint security company. I've mentioned them before. I worked at CrowdStrike, and
Okay.
my previous jobs, I would mix my work and personal all the time. I'd be checking personal email, social media, whatever on my work laptop. When I went to work at CrowdStrike, it was like, oh, they're a company in their startup phase, but they. Dmitry Alperovich had just talked about a bunch of stuff at RuxCon, and they'd been targeted potentially, by things in the past, and they were on China's radar and Russia's radar, and the threat actors and what have you. And I was like, I better clean up my act. So I started separating my personal, my work stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have anything on my work device
Mm-hmm.
that is of a personal nature. I don't check email. I don't do anything on there. As a matter of fact, I'm at work right now, and this is my personal device. So I use the personal device to do everything that I need to do. Um, some people find that hard to do, and I'm not exactly sure why.
I don't
But
know
I
either.
remember in my previous, yeah, in my previous job, I was doing stuff on there, and I went to do some spring cleaning in my Google Drive like years later, and I was like, oh, here's some firewall rule sets that I used to have when I was doing network, audits on, at my previous job. I probably should delete those, and I don't even know why they're in there or something like that. You inadvertently will, have that stuff. And whether or not you intend to share it maliciously or no, you start polluting that environment and going back and forth, and you're going to have problems. If I don't log into work stuff on my personal laptop, I don't have work stuff on my phone,
Mm-hmm.
even though I know that there's controls in place for that.
The interesting part
Yeah,
about
I'm not a.
I was gonna say the
Go ahead.
interesting part about that is it kind of works both ways. So you access, your personal like Gmail or your personal Google Drive like at work. Now work has access to all your personal stuff, not just you having access to corporate stuff on your personal
Right,
machine. So it's like, do you really
right,
want work to know like what you're doing in your personal life? Like, do you want them to have access to
right,
these things? Because if you're because I know a lot of organizations are collecting far too much data, do you want them to have access to those? A lot of people like map their, Google Drive or something to like their local desktop or whatnot. It's like just for
yep,
easy access.
yep.
It's like, well, now that you do
Hmm.
that, you've now given your corporate laptop all these permissions to access your personal data.
Right,
So it does really work both ways, and that's kind of how I come at this kind of subject because a lot of people don't really understand. They're like, well, why does it matter if I access my personal Gmail at work? Well, I mean, it's just not something that should be allowed. It's something that you want to limit your personal presence at work because there's a separate time for that. And I think
right,
the way corporations work, I know we kind of touched on this subject earlier, but in this kind of post-pandemic world, the work-life balance has really changed. So it's interesting that even if you're sitting at home, as you said, you've got your work laptop over here and you've got your personal one over here. It's like it's really easy. You get a big enough desk and have your work laptop here, your personal laptop here, and then there's really no problem. And it's
right.
the post-pandemic like have just made that easier because a lot of organizations have adopted this, remote work kind of ideology where you can do most of the work from home, and you have the ability to kind of adjust your hours at work, and get your work done, but you can take 5 minutes
Right.
to check your personal Gmail account. It's just on a different laptop sitting next to you.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also the other thing is, having a personal device that you can do that stuff on.
Hmm.
There may be something that you need to investigate or something like that. It's like, oh, I'm on my Twitter and I'm looking at threat intelligence, or I'm on Mastodon and I'm looking at, some kind of breaking news that came by. And I'm like, there's a lot of times where I'll be like, I see something on Twitter or social network. It's like, oh, there's been a breach, or here's a vulnerability. Here's an O-Day that's come out. And I'm like, oh, okay, I can go get that. Now, okay, I will preface this by I don't have 100% connection, and it's probably the worst one, but I actually have my BreakSec Slack on my work Slack
Okay.
as one of the 5 Slacks that I have. It's definitely a C2 mechanism, but I have controls on my Slack so that, it's only invite only pretty much. And I tend to not click email links or anything in there that, is negative. But if there's a news article or something, I send myself a message, a DM, and then I can, post it up into our internal, Slack messages systems. And, hey, I found this on Twitter. Let me know. It's better than email in many cases, but yeah, it's probably the worst example. But it is far better than what I used to have.
It's not that it's a worse example. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human. No one, I don't care how, robotic or workaholic that you may be, no one is going to sit there and do 8 hours of continuous work and, just be focused purely on that. So organizations have to understand that. So, having those types of things. So this is why a lot of organizations sometimes do allow access to personal webmail. They actually just limit, attachments or things like that. So like people do, spend a few minutes, updating their Facebook, updating their social media, browsing Twitter. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I do the same thing. I'm on Twitter. I'm looking through. I mean, sometimes that's the best kind of information because you have so many people online doing so many things and you're like, that's a really interesting story. So sometimes it's great to kind of peruse social media for these breaking stories, because ultimately in the world that we live in today, those are the first places that the stories are going to break. It's just how it works. So I mean, you're not the only one. I'm definitely guilty of it. I'm like, hey, I really want to, like, my organization needs to know about this, or I have like organizations, this is hitting home, like they just experienced this. Look at all this cool information that I have. So, sharing amongst those things, it's going to happen. It's knowing when, it's become too much, or knowing when it's now taken over work in a case. And that's why that, monitoring an organization as a whole, not just targeting certain individuals who are constantly on their personal webmail accounts, but understanding how are these individuals, they're always accessing Twitter, they're always accessing Gmail. How does it differ from the rest of the organization? Maybe they're in roles such as you or I, which would mean that they're, they're looking for these types of security incidents. They're interested in these things. They want to know about them. So they are perusing Twitter more often than someone else. Even though it's allowed in the organization, you have different levels of kind of employee normalness in your activities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm probably the Slack thing. That's really the only mixing of the spaces that I have. I truly, but it's 99% better than what I used to do when I was working at another organization. And there used to be this whole thing where it was like, why are you penalizing work employees for allowing little Billy to do his homework on mommy or daddy's laptop? And it's like, that's why you get owned, that kind of thing. I've isolated my work laptop from the rest of my home network, because it was, again, that thing with CrowdStrike. It was like, I have a flat network in my house. And it's like, if I accidentally, or my daughter or my wife or my cats click on an email link or an attachment or something, and, my whole home networks gets, ransomware, God forbid, we have work devices on there as well. So it's like my work device is separated and isolated onto another network. So there's reasons to have these kinds of separations in many cases. So
they're definitely 100%. I mean, there's always there. It should be kept separate, but I mean, understanding that it's going to happen is better than trying to directly stop it all the time. Like knowing like the actual human instinct of doing something, people are going to do it. It's just about knowing when it's truly an issue versus when it's just, negligent or, non-suspicious activity.
Right. Yeah. So the quiet quitting is kind of the new term that people are using for, employing a side gig. I'm I'm king of the side gigs right now. I have podcasts, doing streams and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I've cleared this with my company, by the way. So, one of my terms of employment was I'm going to continue doing this stuff. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Continue doing that.
Yeah.
I know there's some orgs, it's like, you're not allowed to do stuff outside of work. And I know somebody who used to have a podcast and he's like, oh, I went to work at this company and they said, no, you're not going to speak at any place. You're not going to do any side gigs. Your
Okay.
work is your work and you're going to work 80 hours a week. And, I told him, I was like, I'd walk, if it's like they tell me I can't do this or, it's a condition of employment, I'd be like, I'm out. I can't, I got to continue doing what it is I'm doing. Um, how does this figure into insider threat in this case? Or is this more of the, separating personal and work, or is this, you're finding out information internally and you're sharing it externally, and then that's what the worry is? Or, I mean, what in
Yeah.
terms of quiet quitting, what
So
does that look like for
it's
you?
kind of funny. I kind of separate this idea of side gigs and quiet quitting. I come at quiet quitting from the perspective that it's more about keeping your job, but doing as little as possible. Not necessarily to have time to do other things, but truly just doing as little as possible at your current position. Now, of course, that leaves it open for you to do other side gigs, maybe something that you're more interested in doing. But I know that this kind of whole sensation was, and I think it started from that like TikTok video, that like it was really just used to like assess work-life balance. I also hate TikTok, not just from a security aspect, but I feel like it just drains the life out of you sometimes. But I think
Right.
it did start where people were kind of like looking to reassess their work life balance. And that really did come from this post pandemic world where we are, working from home, working remotely, and we don't have to travel into the office. We are cutting down that
Right.
time. So I think that can do, as long as you're getting your job done and you're doing what's expected of you, then I don't see why you can't do little side gigs if you that you've approved it with your organization. It's not like a conflict of interest or anything like that. But I don't like this kind of idea of quiet quitting because ultimately it's really testing, the trust between employees and employers. And it's kind of started to erode that trust because people are getting this idea that, well, if I don't do my job, I can still keep my job. Doesn't really make much sense
Right.
to me. It's
Right.
also this whole what was the whole idea of the Great Resignation in 2021 when like there was like a
Right.
lot of people like the stress between the employee employer relationship was just it just spiked incredibly that there was just so many people struggling in their current jobs, and a lot of that did come from trying to understand how to work during COVID, and then realizing that, hey, I can do my work from home. Why do I have to go back to the office? That's why this whole
Right.
idea is happening. I think organizations need to do a better job at listening to their employee bases and listening to their workers. They have to understand
Right.
that like there's a lot of people out there that are struggling to kind of adapt to remote work. Well, there's a lot of people that love remote work. I think that they're with
Yeah.
the technology that we have today, I don't see why there are issues with kind of adopting this kind of remote lifestyle. Obviously, I know that there are positions where obviously you need to be in an office. Working for the government obviously can be one of them. Doctors, nurses,
Right.
those types of things. Like obviously there are times when being physically present at your office or at your work location is necessary. But I think that organizations really need to identify those areas and then also identify when maybe we don't need to work in the office. We can allow people to work from home. Oddly
Right.
enough, I do a lot of investigations like on side gigs. And a lot of times it's not actually quiet quitting. It's they've increased their job or they've increased their hours at their current position. Mainly because a
Yeah.
lot of times we identify people doing side gigs and it's because they're actually utilizing corporate resources. So
Oh, yes.
so it kind of
Okay.
comes at it like, hey, I'm doing my job, but I'm doing the other job. But it's not always identifiable to the organization. So you're still doing as little as possible for your job, but it looks like you're doing work for your job. So it's pretty interesting
Right.
so this is why I kind of keep those kind of terms separate, at least for me. Again, quiet quitting is more about, doing as little as possible, but, staying in the good graces of your organization, which we know
Right.
doesn't really work. But the side gig,
All of a sudden,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. All of a sudden, Bob's working 80 hours a week, and that's because 40 of them he's using company assets to, incubate his startup or something like
Yeah,
that in stealth.
exactly. So it's like you, all right, so you're like, kind of
Oh no.
you're tapping into your corporate resources while trying to, do this other side job. So yeah, you are quiet
Oh
quitting. You kind
no.
of quit, you're doing your job, but it's because you're using all the
Goodness.
time to kind of start up this business. That's when it can definitely become a problem. And that's when it truly becomes an issue for insider threat, because at that point, if you're using corporate resources for another job, how are you utilizing those resources? What information is being passed between applications for you to access the information? All of that. So it's truly interesting. It's definitely a really interesting use case. And that's actually partially why we've started working more with HR, kind of bringing back,
Right.
bringing it all back around to this idea of like
Right.
HR led investigations. HR knows those individuals that are potentials for quiet quitting. They know those individuals that are not really doing their job or not happy with their job. So why not work with HR to help, prevent those things from happening and actually understand your employee population a little bit better?
Yeah. So, we've talked about quiet quitting. We're talking about a lot of companies who, during the pandemic was like, yes, you can go work in middle of, the desert or whatever when the pandemic was going on. And now you're going to have to, move from your nice, where your family is in the Midwest back to SFO and, spend $800,000 for a 200 square foot apartment. Are you seeing an uptick in investigations because of the return to work stuff? Because hey, I thought I was going to be working 5 days a week in the middle of America. Now I have to move home. Are you seeing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we're definitely not necessarily seeing like an uptick in, investigations overall, just a different style of investigations. We're seeing a lot more. I mean, most of the investigations are around data loss and the potential for data loss, but organizations are, looking more at individuals that have those types of issues that, hey, where we saw that, you were uploading your resume somewhere and we, want to know what's going on, or we have a person who's, moving away or, moving somewhere. Why aren't they happy? Things like that. That's another thing that I wanted to mention, was that there are ways looking at, kind of like monitoring these activities, not always, beneficial for the organization, but again, beneficial for the employees. Because if, you're moving away, what are you going to do? You're going to research that area. You're going to like look up things to do. Or maybe,
Right.
you are posting on social media that you're upset with the move, or you're talking to your coworkers that you're upset with the move, or you're upset in this way. So knowing that information, it helps the organization be like, okay, well, maybe we have to talk with this individual. Maybe we have to know, what can they do to help that individual, versus forcing this individual to move back when they could easily do their job from home or do their job
Right.
from where they
Okay.
exist there.
Right. So I know this is probably the boring part, but I want to talk about those policies. You said a lot of it is helping to create useful and meaningful
Mm-hmm.
policies. I'm assuming you're doing things like helping with terms and conditions. I mean, what does a good policy look like? And what if the company says, hey, we don't have policies against monitoring or doing side gigs or whatever? I mean, what kind of policies are you coming in to do in this case?
So a lot of it in deals with kind of everyday kind of stuff. One that I really love looking at actually is password keepers or storing of passwords.
Okay.
One that's a huge policy implementation that we've been working with a lot of organizations, and it's just looking at data where people are storing passwords on their desktop, like in a spreadsheet, or even worse, in a
Okay.
in a text file. Which I don't know for anyone that's watching. If you do store it in a text file, you shouldn't, because the text file can't be encrypted. At least like Microsoft Office
Right.
documents can be encrypted with like a password or something like that. So it's always interesting to kind of show that data to an organization. They're like, we can't believe that's been happening. I'm like, it's happening a lot more than you think. You got a whole list of people. Now, again, I'm not
Yeah.
targeting anyone individually for that. I'm just looking at the behaviors that is happening in the organization, and it's actually apparent throughout the entire organization. Like everybody's doing it. So one policy that we work towards implementing is, some sort of password manager, whether it be like a key pass, a last pass, whatever application your company wants to use. Those are the types of policies that
Right.
we're trying to help implement. So we're also looking to kind of, again, with this whole personal usage, a lot of times organizations have these policies in place, like they don't want people accessing Gmail, they don't want people accessing Facebook, or they don't want people utilizing ChatGPT. So but they don't have the data to show, like, well, we have this many users doing it. How do we like, get our organization to understand the risks behind it if we don't even have the data to show that, employees are doing it? So it's more about identifying what works for the organization itself and about enforcing policies that probably already exist, not necessarily about,
Right.
implementing new ones, which sometimes we do. But it's more about like usage of the machine itself, of the corporate device.
Right. Digital Warhead, one of our good friends here up in the Seattle area, says my employer offers KeyPass and no one uses it. There was a time I tried pushing our group to use a shared KeyPass database and was met with major pushback, so I gave up, and all of our creds are default from the manufacturer. Don't tell me that kind of stuff, Digital Warhead. That's not safe.
That's
But
definitely not
so,
safe and definitely a little scary. But
uh,
yeah, that's a
yeah,
problem. We come across that all the time. With organizations like, I have the evidence to show that the data is there, and they're like, we don't care. And
yeah,
I can't do anything if you don't
yeah,
care. I'm trying to help
yeah.
you, but
Yeah. So to come back to some of the stuff we were talking about, we talked about the Air National Guardsman who apparently lives near you. Do you know him? No, I'm just kidding. That was a joke we talked about before we started.
I do. I
You
know him
don't know
personally.
that
Taught him
person.
taught him everything he
Yeah.
knows. Taught him
Yeah.
everything he knows.
That's okay. Yeah. So one of the things that I think a lot of civilians and people don't understand is, how did he get access to this intelligence data? And just like Edward Snowden, he was an IT person, so he has
Mhm.
access to the IT systems that hold and can access that data. Um, so are you also coming in to kind of do a deterrent thing? Are you going like, hey, you've got this file server where 800 people have access to this data? Maybe only 50 people need access to this data. Why are you giving them access to this stuff?
Oh
Are
yeah.
you doing that kind of stuff, like role-based access control? Getting rid of making sure offboarding is being done correctly. I mean,
Oh
are
yeah.
those the kinds of processes you're looking at too?
Oh yeah. Like I said, I'm not really in the kind of I'm not doing the remediation, or I'm not doing the
Right.
actual
Right.
offboarding, but I've definitely helped my customers identify, areas of weakness for those types of things. Is actually understanding, the access that people have. Interestingly
Right.
enough, we'll have, a customer come in, and they'll have someone that they offboarded, and all of a sudden we'll still see data populate for them even after they've left. And the organization is
Mm.
like, how is this possible? So it's kind of identifying those areas of weakness and admitting that you may need to have some policy changes. You may need to actually adjust these processes that you have in place because they're obviously not working. It's really,
Right.
really
Right.
important to understand the type of access that you're giving to certain individuals, and to understand how they're utilizing that access. I think we talked earlier, a really simple kind of non-malicious use case about application usage. Now, this type of
Mhm.
thought can be used for server access, or things like that, but you have all of these licenses for Adobe Pro, or say you have, 1,000 licenses for Adobe Pro, but you only have, 50 users that are utilizing Adobe Pro. So why are you paying for
Right.
all of these licenses when only 50 people are using them? The same can apply to access to a server. You have all of these users that have a login for this server, but only, 50% of those users are accessing it on a regular basis. It's when the other 50% that is not accessing it, and then one of them leaves the organization, that they're going to say, hey, I have access to this server. I know I don't normally need it, but I'm going to go in there and grab a bunch of data. So it's really understanding
Right.
your access control. So kind of getting to that level of, understanding. So on my side of the fence, I'm doing my best to understand what data I'm collecting and how I'm collecting and how I'm using it. Organizations need to adopt that same type of mentality. They need to know, what data they have, where the data is stored, and who has access to that data. And they really need to
Right.
make it a point to ensure that the people that do have access to that data actually need access for it. And then obviously there are a lot of ways that organizations can put temporary access on things. Like say there's a project happening, hey, you can have access to this stuff during the project. And then monitor closely after that project is over to make sure that the access has been revoked or that the user hasn't done something to, continue their access even after the project has ended.
That's good advice. So let's say my company is now out of startup. We've had our first round of funding. We're doing something like, creating the floating toilet seat of the future. And we have enough people in our organization that it's like, maybe we need to have a team or an insider threat team. What would be some of the first things? I mean, who would be on that team? Would it be like you would hire somebody specifically to do insider threat, or would it be like, hey, IT guy, you're also the insider threat person, or hey, IT guy and junior HR person, you're now the new insider threat team, or what is that? Or should we just contact DTEX and have them do it for us? Or, I mean, what does that look like?
So interestingly enough, I've seen both kind of sides of the coin where we've worked with organizations, or I've worked personally with organizations that they'll take random people from their current employer or employee list, that HR person or that IT person, and throw them into this role and be like, you're the new insider threat team. But they have no insider threat experience. So you need to be sure that you have some sort of training lined up, whether that be
Right.
internally, where say you bring in maybe an expert from someplace like DTEX to have them trained, or you train them yourselves with insider threat, and maybe you have that sort of kind of background. My suggestion is it's because it's so different from IT work and incident response. It's really important to bring in someone that has insider threat experience and has been working with it. And again, it's because it's again, I started working in a SOC and I was doing, alerts all day. I was responding to alerts and doing all of these things. And it's just so
Right.
different than, the alerts and investigations that I work on now. And so it can be tough to just throw in some random individual to a new role, especially without giving any sort of context or training. So I've seen it work though,
Yeah.
especially working with organizations where we'll provide the training to them. We'll let them know, how to come at certain types of investigations, and understanding, the behaviors behind activities, not just like the indicators of compromise. So many people are more focused on the end result. They're focused on the actual exfiltration or the actual compromise, when in reality, for an insider threat perspective, you're more interested in what happened to lead up to those events. And it's a
Right.
very unique analytical perspective to have, but it's what works for insider threat. So again, in my opinion, you can obviously hire internally, but I always suggest that you make sure you have training lined up and you make sure that you have some sort of insider threat, you know, subject matter expert to help you along the way.
Okay. So you've done some SOC work, you've done some incident response stuff. How should an insider threat scenario be part of every incident response tabletop that you do? I guess that's kind of a rhetorical question. I guess the answer is yes, but
Yeah.
how do you go about doing that? I mean, what would be a legitimate scenario? It's like, oh yeah, Brian, we just fired Brian and he's the head of IT, or he was the lead developer, so he has access to everything. I mean, what are some legitimate exercises that, let's say we've got somebody out there asking, hey, how would I set up an insider threat, tabletop or playbook or something like that? What would be a good go-to, or, good format to do that in?
Yeah, so to answer your original question, yes, it should always be part of some sort of training them that you provide, or some sort of tabletop exercise.
Right.
Um, Coming at it from that sort of experience is you can be your own insider threat. Is start to look at yourself as an individual. A lot of people or a lot of organizations are really kind of hyper focused on specific types of events that specific types of individuals will go through. But for some
Right.
sort of tabletop exercise, you want to kind of come at it from a different perspective. You want to look at it from the organizational point of view. You want to look at it from the user against the whole organization, and then look at it from, the groups that your organization has. So you want to separate it into different ways of insider threat first. And then what you want to be able to do is obviously you can set up testing environments, and maybe you have someone from your IT team, hey, go do something bad. See if you can set up a red team and blue team. It's kind of some of the best ways to really learn is kind of adopting that sort of, testing mentality. Because if you have these individuals that, know what they're doing, they'd be able to kind of set up these environments where, all right, I'm going to do a whole bunch of nefarious things. Obviously, I don't suggest using your, actual production data or production environment, but to each their own. But setting up in those kind of tests for your kind of red teams or your blue teams is a really great way to kind of start understanding your data set and understanding,
Okay.
what it looks normal. But again, you want to know what looks normal to the organization, what looks normal to specific users, and then what looks normal to specific groups of those users, because all of those come into play when you're trying to get a baseline of what your organization looks like as a whole.
Okay. So we talked about. I've got one other thing I was just thinking about when you were talking about groups of people and collusion and
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things. Do companies trust their contractors or third parties too much? Because I'm thinking of a supply chain kind of issue. It's not like, where we're putting it. I mean, obviously we're pulling down dependencies all day, but a lot of the major breaches have been inadvertent third party issues, and where third parties had too much access. I think I hate to bring up Target, but Target was a third party air conditioner HVAC vendor, for
Yep.
instance, that had either too much access or it allowed. And this is more an external thing than an internal thing, obviously. But some of the controls that we've talked about earlier, putting into place, would also work for an external third party attacker kind of thing. But if you bring in a contractor to do work with you as a sub or something like that, do, are they trusted too much in some cases? I mean, is it a
I
what can we do
it's
to protect against that kind of stuff?
I think that it doesn't always necessarily come down to a trust issue. I think it comes down to the fact that we're not really controlling the access from the get-go. Um, in reality, we really have to be aware of, a contractor's role and truly limit what their access is. A lot of people or a lot of organizations will think, well, this contractor is going to be working on so many things. Let me just, give them access to everything. I mean, that's great. And that allows them to do their job. But ultimately, it's going to allow them to have access that they probably don't need. I feel like we need to have a
Right.
better checks and balances system. And I don't want to call out, any organization or, think that I'm calling any organization out for being lazy or things like that. But we do have to understand that a contractor's position is temporary. So we should understand that access needs to be temporary and those controls need to be put in place in a very specific way. More often than not,
Right.
contractors are brought in to do a specific project. They only should have access to do
Right.
that project. And if they need access outside of that, there needs to be a system in place for them to ask for that access, not just gain it themselves. So you want to make sure you have, I hate being a ticket land. I don't know anyone that really actually enjoys ticket land. But
Right.
utilizing a ticketing system is really important and it helps keep track of your access. So contractors should have the ability to, put in a ticket for more access and justify their reason for the access. And all of that needs to be vetted. And I understand that it can take away from, business productivity, but at the end of the day, it's business productivity versus, your insider threat landscape. So you
Right.
kind of have to pick and choose where you accept the risk, because ultimately you're going to
Right.
have to accept the risk on some level. So it's about organizations picking where they're going to accept the risk and how they're going to accept the risk. And unfortunately, that's a decision that I can't make for anyone in particular or any organization in particular, but I can definitely assist and, like I've given my insights on of how I think it should be done. Then again, I'm not the one setting up those accesses. I'm not doing that. I know a lot of work goes into that, and that's why a lot of people say that business productivity comes into play. But then it comes back to that whole
Right.
idea: are you going to accept that risk? If you are, great. If you're not, then something needs to change.
Right. We got a question from Baron Brady. Thank you first, Baron, for using your Prime Gaming subscription. Appreciate that very much. Baron says, I work internal threat and I'm psyched to hear more. You can catch the VOD afterwards, of course, but you don't work for my internal threat team, do you? No, I'm just kidding. Baron asks, how proactive do you find yourself versus being reactive? Speaking of Ticketland.
With my whole understanding of kind of the insider threat landscape is that I want to see organizations be more proactive versus reactive. Unfortunately, we live in a reactive world. That's, said, we have tickets come in, something has happened, ticket comes in, and we respond to that ticket. Or maybe it's not a ticket, it's an alert, whatever it is. That's more of a reactive way of thinking. For me, as an insider threat analyst, I do a lot of investigations, but a lot of times what I'm really looking for is not, what happened. Like, we already know data was exfilled, or we already know that this compromise occurred, or we already know this user left the organization. But I want to look at it from a perspective of the actual data set behind all of those activities or all of those possible events. And I don't necessarily need a ticket to do that. I'd rather get an understanding of the data as a whole versus answer a bunch of tickets all day long to justify, my job as an analyst. I don't justify, like, I've completed 16 investigation tickets today. I
Right.
personally don't think that's a job well done for an insider threat analyst, because ultimately you had 16 investigations because events happened. And I want the idea of insider
Right.
threat. It needs to be more proactive. We need to start
Right.
understanding our organization's kind of data sets. We need to understand, what is normal behavior for organization, and identify when those behaviors become abnormal before they turn into incidents. So I don't think that, Ticketland's a great place to be. And I understand a lot of organizations like have SLAs, and you need to get through so
Right.
many tickets or so many incidents a day. But we really, in my personal opinion, really do need to change that concept around insider threat, because it doesn't work. It works for external threats. And I know that because external threats happen. A lot of times it involves a 0 day. So we don't know that it's going to happen because it's a new vulnerability that we don't know about. With insider threat, it's different. We have data points that will lead up
Right.
to an incident occurring. There are certain ways in which we can identify an exfiltration event before it happens based on a user's behavior prior. You don't have that luxury with an external threat, but we do with insider threat, which is why I think we need that whole mentality to change and kind of get out of this like SLA ticket land.
Right. So, Baron, please feel free to continue asking questions, because I'm sorry you got here so late, but we had a bunch of other questions we asked too. But so you're talking about Ticketland. How many? I don't know how to say this. Let me see. There was a story about a guy in France who actually successfully sued his company because they fired him because he wasn't a good culture fit. And I was thinking about that poor guy, and I was like, well, he might have been flagged as an insider threat because he didn't get involved in group encounters. He wasn't following the culture of the company, and that puts him on the back foot of, hey, what's wrong with him?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make him an insider threat? And my wonder is the Ticketland stuff that Baron is talking about, and yourself is it sometimes a witch hunt? Is it sometimes, hey, this person's different, so hey, does that make them an insider threat? I'm just supremely introverted, and I don't want to leave my house and drive 90 minutes to work to be involved in something. So it's like, Are there witch hunts? Do you ever come in and go, hey, there's nothing wrong with this person, they just don't like being in the office, or they don't like going to drinking games after hours, or um, I'll stop here.
So I wouldn't say that there are truly witch hunts. Normally, anytime I'm conducting an investigation, it always has some reasoning behind it. And I'm not really, again, I'm not really privy to that sort of information when I'm looking at or when I'm conducting investigations. So I don't know, like, again, we're just kind of starting to incorporate HR into our kind of everyday insider threat, projects. But more often than not, I've seen something and it looks strange.
Right.
And it would be, why is this user accessing multiple personal profiles? That's really strange. Why is this
Okay.
why is this user doing something different? They've always utilized a USB, but all of a sudden they've not uploaded, their 5 files a day. They've uploaded 1,000 to a USB.
Right.
Those are all
Right.
changes in a user's behavior. So it almost always, for me, there always usually needs to be some sort of change in behavior. That's not to say that a witch hunt could be successful. It's very possible. I've personally never been involved in this sort of case, but we have been toying with the idea of external factors turning people into insider threats. Which obviously
Mm-hmm.
we, as looking at data sets, we're not privy to what's happening in someone's home or what they're going through in their personal life. But
Right.
those do play a role in an employee's attitude at work. And your attitude at work is something that should be, again, monitored for from an HR perspective to know, like, is workplace violence a thing? Now, I mean, we
Right.
can look to see if you're, doing harmful research. Are you researching? Are you going to harm yourself or others? Are you kind of, are you being radicalized? Or if there are those types of things happening? Obviously,
Right.
those are all factors that can be looked into, and it plays a role. But again, those still all equate to changes in a human's behavior versus an introvert that may just not want to be social. It might be, you want to know why. Are they just introverted? Is that just their personality? Do they get their work done? Are they happy with their job? They just, don't want to interact in a social aspect. That's totally fine. I wouldn't say that
Right.
that indicates them as an insider threat. But if they've always been interactive and they've always, been a social being or somewhat social, they've come to the office before, then all of a sudden stop and they stop interacting and they, become more and
Right.
more introverted, again, that's definitely a red flag. So I wouldn't call those situations witch hunts because there is still a reasoning behind them, if that makes sense.
Right. No, that I was taking it to that other, because I was thinking, how many times have you come in and had an investigation where you're like, well, we're worried about this person, and you're like, he's,
There's been no,
there's
yeah,
nothing wrong with this
there's
person,
been many
you
times.
know.
There's many times. And sometimes I don't always know the reasoning for an investigation. I'm not privy to that information. They just say, hey,
Oh.
hey, look into this user. And again, like I said, I don't know the user's role in the organization. I don't know who the user is. I'm just the data expert. So I know what the data that I'm looking
Okay.
at, I'm able to kind of say, but I'll come back and be like, there's nothing weird about this user. There's no indication of, behavioral changes. There's no activity changes. But sometimes an organization is just, no, we know they did something. From my perspective, they
Okay.
didn't.
Yeah.
So it depends. Like, say, as again, me as an analyst, I like to do, overarching threat hunting and like taking a look from a higher level point of view and trying to identify, hey, how many users are like utilizing the Tor browser? How many utilizers are,
Right. Right.
watching tri-pirated media? How many users are uploading to USB or uploading to personal webmail? I'll look for those things, but
Right.
a lot of times there are some investigations that come down from an organization, and I don't get to know some of the context behind it. I only have
Right.
access to the data that I'm seeing, and sometimes that means that there's nothing. Other times it has led to, court cases and legal involvement and all of that kind of stuff. Those are always the most interesting cases. but sometimes I just don't have the organization can't provide the context. That's another thing about kind of trusting your contractors. Like to me, I'm just their contractor that, they're utilizing to look at data. So how much access do they want to give me?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
accepting the risk as the data expert by not giving me the context. I could miss something. They're accepting that
Right.
risk. And I'm not saying that's a choice
Right.
that, everyone has to make, or the best choice. Again, it's all about that organization's choice of how much risk they're willing to accept.
Right, right. And in a perfect world, contractors are covered by NDAs, they're covered by,
Yeah.
the trust of the company that, the company is going to hopefully do background checks and make sure that the person that is going to be working with you isn't complete dirtbag.
You'd hope.
So it's interesting. Yeah, you hope. So you're that's interesting because I've done pen tests, I've done security assessments, I've been a TPM, an engagement manager for those. You're coming in very much almost like a gray box test where you don't know everything.
Hmm.
It sounds like so. Are you given when you go in to do an investigation? Are you given a name, and what kind of latitude do you have? You're given this information. Are you given like a name? Hey, Bob is one of our employees, and you don't know what his position is, but a quick Google search can tell you Bob is the VP of engineering, or Bob is one of the newest developers here working at the office. So how do you keep yourself from like going outside of work or going outside of the area? And do you have a rule of engagement like, hey, you can't go look at his social media, or you can't go look at their LinkedIn profile, or you can't go look at their private posts? Are there off limit areas?
Well, unfortunately, that's kind of diving into the realm of OSINT data, which is open source intelligence.
Right,
And
right,
then
right, right.
again, you don't really have much reasonable expectation of privacy, going back to kind of my law days. But then there's also kind of the integrity of the analyst, and how much I really need to know that user to understand the problem. A lot of times I'm given a user, but again, what the data that I'm looking at is anonymized. So even if they give
Right,
me a
right.
name, I can use OSINT data, and it's definitely helpful. And as an investigator, I use OSINT data all the time, but that doesn't mean that for every investigation, I need to know what a user's role is. I can't say this for every analyst, but for me, I use what I can to help the organization get the answer they're looking for. Sometimes
Right.
that will require, a deeper dive into a user themselves. And, a lot of people say, well, that comes down to, employee monitoring and surveillance. I'm like, well, at the end of the day, it is a targeted investigation, but there's reasoning behind that targeted investigation. I may not know what that is at the time. That's up to the organization themselves, and to understand that. So they're accepting that risk. I'm not necessarily accepting that risk because I don't have that context, but I'm doing my best with the information that I'm provided to ensure that nothing has compromised the security of the organization itself. So again,
Right.
I don't like to, say that I'm working for the organization, but ultimately, as a software company, that's what we are doing. And I'm not trying to
Right.
go against the user population at all. But yeah, but that's kind of, again, goes back to this whole privacy talk again. So, how much privacy do you really have if you're posting about yourself online, and that helps me in my
Right.
investigation?
Right. Yeah, we when we had Joe Gray on, I had mentioned I was going to be talking to you about this, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I could tell you a bunch." And I was like, "Nope, we're going to have Lynsey on. We're not going to have you on. We've already had you on. We've had Joe on several times. Joe is a very good OSINT person, and he was, he's. I'm sure that your investigations and his investigations would be completely different. I
Probably,
assume
but
you also can't invest. You can't like you're not interviewing that person either. Like you said, it's anonymized data, so
no, yeah,
it's
no,
yeah.
I'm not
Um,
going to the person.
right, right,
I usually have no
right,
contact with the individual themselves. I merely have contact to the operational team that I'm currently working with. So yeah, I
right,
don't usually have any contact with the individual or the target of the investigation. But
right.
I do find OSINT very fascinating. I have an individual that I work with on my team that is very well versed in it, and it's great to have kind of that mindset because it is a really great use of resources. But
Right.
like I said, it's not always necessary to, get the conclusion that you're looking for as well.
Right on. Okay. Uh, does anybody else have any? What about the other side of things? Has Lynsey ever felt like a company is divulging too much information and trying to build a false narrative? I think I asked that question a little bit with the is this a witch hunt thing,
Hmm.
but um, I guess it could go in either way. Have you ever had instances where the company's like, here's the information, you're like, well, this doesn't tell me anything. Like you said, they're collecting too much information, but there's no context. So
Yeah.
what if
I,
are they giving you too much information? What happens if they don't give you anything? It's like, hey, here's some logs, and you're like,
yeah, sometimes
no, they're fine.
yeah, sometimes I've been involved in some investigations where I'll get, a user's role, like where they live, what it's like, well, why do I need to know this? I mean, I'm looking to see how
Right.
often they access their, you know, Outlook. Like I don't care what they're doing. So yeah, there are
Right.
definitely those times where you sometimes give off too much information. And I think it's not really any fault of anyone's. It's not with malicious intent that this information is being given. It's just a lot of times when it comes to investigations or when providing, context, people think that the more you give, the better context we have. But
Right.
it's not more, it's like it'll go back to that, famous saying, it's about, quality, not quantity. Sometimes the
Right.
more information you give actually separates it too much and gives way too much context. And now I have way too much to work with. It's better to actually have more of a narrow focus and then potentially ask for more information afterwards. Maybe I, come across some odd activities and, say they're opening up a weird VPN process or something like that. I may go to the organization and be like, hey, does this individual live in an area, or does this individual need special access, which is why they're, utilizing this VPN and not what the rest of the organization is utilizing? Like I might ask those types of questions and might get more context, things like that. But yeah, ultimately, it does go back to that kind of saying, it's more about the quality of things than the quantity. So it's not always best to provide all of the details. Sometimes it's good to have a much more
Right.
narrow focus.
Right. Baron had one more question. And I think we'll wrap it up here. It
Mhm.
says, do you do any kind of moonlighting? Do you have a side gig?
I don't necessarily have a side gig, but I do teach snowboarding. That's my side gig.
Okay. Nice. Okay. Wait, is there a lot of snowboarding in the upper eastern seaboard?
Yeah, there is. I snowboard a lot in Vermont. So it's one of my
Oh, okay.
it's one
Okay.
of my other passions. So I wouldn't really call it moonlighting. But yeah, it's been approved with my organization. They know that I do it. But it would be much more interesting if I was, an analyst for, this cool like FBI organization, But unfortunately,
Right. Right.
no true moonlighting for me other than my passion for snowboarding.
Now, if you did an insider threat investigation at a snowboarding company that you knew,
That might
maybe
be,
there's a little bit,
yeah,
yeah,
that might be a
yeah,
little bit of a cross. If the
yeah,
snowboarding company
yeah,
asked to be like, hey, can you look into your coworkers? Yeah, sure, I have
yeah,
experience in that. That would be a
right,
little weird.
yeah. That's good. Okay. So I do want to talk. I do want to let you, get some stuff in about DTEX. What does DTEX do, and what services does DTEX offer there?
So DTEX, we're specialized in insider threat. We're probably one of the leading companies that are, diving into the actual ideas behind insider threat. And we're working with a lot of other organizations doing research on it. It is a huge passion of mine. I've really come to love it. Mostly my role at DTEX involves more of a customer facing role and assisting customers help implement their own insider threat programs, which is something that we do. We also provide training, as I talked about earlier, to kind of understand the difference between insider threat and external threats. We do offer
Right.
various levels of like professional services. So if you don't have, the staff at your organization, if you're a customer of ours, we do offer our own expertise to be able to assist with you in getting, investigations started, anything like that. We are, again, mostly our thought is we're an endpoint software. We sit on the endpoint. We're not collecting, video content and key logging and all of those kind of what I was talking about earlier, that high context, but, high privacy concern data points. We're really focused more on the, behavioral aspects and correlating kind of the lower privacy concern data points like window activity and file activity, things like that. But it's a really great organization. It's something that I've had a lot of experience with now. Like I said, I've been working in insider threat for about 7 years, and DTEX has really kind of paved the way to identify insider threat as a really growing problem and something that's kind of surpassing this idea of external threats and malware, in my opinion, anyway. So yeah, if anyone does, yeah, obviously feel free. You can definitely reach out to me if any questions. I would love to get, in contact with anybody. But yeah, it'd be great to, have this chat further.
Very cool. Is it dtech.com? Detech?
DTEX.
Detech.com?
Yep. So yeah, it
Detex.
should be DTEX. Yep. DTEX systems. So
Detect systems.
yep.
Okay.
And
And are y'all hiring? What's your skill set like for somebody doing investigations? I know you've got some pretty advanced degree kind of stuff going on there, but
yeah, we are hiring. We're always looking, or I'm always looking for analysts. Really anyone with kind of any sort of analytical experience, whether that be kind of, in a SOC or a knock, or if you have insider threat experience, is
okay.
great. We're also always looking for those that have more technical experience as well, development and things like that. We do a lot of research, so even researchers are always helpful. That we're always researching for our own intelligence to kind of enhance our, use case profiles that we're helping our customers identify. So
Right.
yeah, anyone with that sort of experience, you don't necessarily have to have insider threat experience. But data analytics, things like that are always helpful.
All right, very cool. All right, Lynsey, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time, and I appreciate Tony from the PR firm for hooking us up here. It just hit at the right time, and like I told Lynsey before we started this, I have probably engaged 3 of these kinds of things where some PR person just blindly emails me and says, "Hey, you should have this person on your show," and it was like the HR stuff initiating. I was like, why would they do that? And it's like, oh, okay, now I need to have I need to have Lynsey on so we can talk about that. So cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lynsey, for coming. And that's it for Breaking Down Security this week. Take a look at our Discord, discord.gg/breaksec. You can check us out on Twitter at Brian Break. That's me. At Breaksec on Twitter, BRAKESEC. Miss Berlin, you can find her at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Hackers Health is her nonprofit for mental health awareness in the InfoSec community, is at Hackers Health. And Mr. Betcher, you can follow him on Twitter at Betcherpwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. So, thanks again. Hope everyone has a good week. I'll be back on Friday with some Golang discussions and tutorials. Other than that, hope you have a good week. Take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another. And as we're always fond of saying here, take care of yourselves because you're the only you have. And we'll talk to you again soon.